Here it was again, that goddamn song. I stood in the middle of the empty street, the cold night air pressing against my skin, and listened. It was faint, just a whisper beneath the rustling trees and the distant hum of cicadas. But I knew it was there. I had heard it for weeks, winding its way through my dreams, coiling around my thoughts like a parasite. Elliot's Hollow had always been a quiet town, a place where nothing really happened. People were born here, lived here, and died here, often without ever leaving. It wasn't a place of mysteries. But then the song came and people started to change. I swallowed the lump in my throat and turned toward the diner. Its neon sign flickered weakly, the buzzing light casting pale reflections on the wet pavement. Through the large window I could see them, people sitting at the counter, sipping coffee, talking in low murmurs. But something was wrong. They moved too smoothly, too in sync. Two men at the end of the counter both lifted their cups at the same time, took a sip in unison, then set them down in perfect synchronization. A woman laughed, and half a second later, another woman across the room echoed it, the sound overlapping in an eerie harmony. My pulse pounded in my ears. This wasn't over. I turned, my breathing shallow, my hands trembling. I had destroyed the source. I had shut it down. So why was it still here? Why was it still spreading? I hadn't always been this paranoid. A few weeks ago, I was just Daniel Langley, a small-time reporter for the Hollow Gazette, covering bake sales and town hall meetings. I had lived in Elliot's Hollow my whole life, and I knew everyone here. I knew their faces, their voices, the way old Frank grumbled about the price of gas and how Miss Carter always smelled faintly of lavender and chalk dust. But then the song started. At first, it was barely noticeable, a soft hum beneath the regular programming of our only radio station, 97.3 Hollow Radio. People dismissed it as static, a glitch, something to joke about while buying groceries. But then it got louder, and then the dream started. Mrs. Calloway, the town's beloved baker, was the first to mention it. She told me in a hushed, uncertain voice that she had seen her husband, Alan, in a dream. The problem was, Alan had been dead for 15 years. He was sitting right at the kitchen table, she said, kneading dough with nervous fingers. Just like always, drinking his coffee, smiling at me. I had smiled politely, jotting down notes for what I thought would be a fun, quirky article. But then she said something that made my skin crawl. My neighbor saw us. I had frowned. You mean in real life? No, she whispered, eyes dark with something I couldn't name. In his dream. He saw Alan, saw me talking to him. He wasn't even in the house, Daniel. He was on his porch, but he said he could see us through the window, word for word. I had laughed then because what else was I supposed to do? Call the FBI. But the next day, Mark Atwood, the gas station clerk, told me he had a dream about fishing with his brother. His brother, who later admitted he had dreamed the same thing, from the opposite perspective. I still thought it was just a coincidence, until Miss Carter forgot her own name. She had been teaching in Elliot's Hollow for 20 years. Half the town had learned to read from her. But that morning, she had shown up to school late, standing outside the building looking lost. She just stood there, Mark told me later, voice low and shaken. Like she didn't know where she was, like she didn't know who she was. I had gone to see her myself. When I arrived at the school, she was sitting in the nurse's office, staring at her own reflection in a handheld mirror, frowning as if she didn't recognize her own face. Miss Carter? I asked hesitantly. She blinked up at me, slow and disoriented. Who? I swallowed. You're Miss Carter, the first grade teacher. She shook her head. No, that's not right. I'm someone else. Who? Her mouth opened, then closed. Her fingers trembled against the mirror. I don't remember. She wasn't the only one. Henry Weaver, the man who had run the general store for 30 years, suddenly refused to open the cash register. He stood behind the counter, shaking his head, mumbling, I don't work here. His son, Matt, tried to reason with him. Dad, you own the store. Henry just looked at me then, his voice small, fragile. I'm the mayor, but he wasn't. John Harley was. Except John Harley was missing. I should have left then. I should have packed my bags, gotten in my car, and driven until the song was nothing but a distant memory. But I didn't, because this was my town. These were my people, and something was stealing them. I had to understand. So I did the only thing I could think of. I turned on the radio, and I listened. At first, it was just a sound, a low hum stretching endlessly in the back of my mind, like the distant hum of power lines on a hot summer day. Then I felt it, a pull, not physical, not something I could resist by gripping onto my chair or shutting my eyes. It was deeper than that, like something was unraveling inside me, something that had been tightly wound my entire life, but was now loosening, piece by piece. I knew I was falling asleep, but it didn't feel like sleep. It felt like being pulled under. Then I was somewhere else. Elliot's Hollow, but not. The building stretched impossibly far into the distance, flickering like old television signals, their forms shifting between familiar and wrong. Some houses looked like they had been abandoned for decades, their wood rotted, their windows dark and hollow. Others looked too new, pristine, untouched by time. The people weren't right either. I turned my head, my breath hitching. They were standing along the sidewalks, in the middle of the street, frozen in place. Their bodies flickered like they couldn't decide what they were supposed to be. Miss Carter stood outside the school, but her face blurred and shifted like she was two people at once. Henry Weaver, the store clerk who thought he was the mayor, stood motionless, his mouth opening and closing over and over, like he was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. And then there were the others, the ones who had been here too long. I saw a mother cradling an infant, rocking it slowly. I stepped closer and nearly screamed. The baby's face was hers. A smaller, stretched version of her own face pressed against her shoulder, whispering silent words in unison. Their limbs fused together in places, the skin stitching them into a single writhing shape. They turned to look at me at the same time. Two sets of identical eyes, two mouths speaking in perfect unison. We are one, we are one, we are one. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting. Some had grown too large. I saw a man, or something that had once been a man, now a tangled mass of bodies, shifting and struggling, their faces pressing against his skin like something trying to escape. A hand burst from his chest, fingers flexing before it was swallowed back inside. He turned, his three mouths speaking in unison. Daniel. I ran. I didn't make it far before a hand grabbed my wrist. I jerked away, my breath ragged, but the grip was steady. Human. Real. Abel Cooper. The old blind man who always sat outside the general store, smoking his pipe. Except even he wasn't untouched. There was a shadow of another face behind his own, flickering in and out of existence like a second exposure in a photograph. His voice was his own, but just a split second behind, something else whispered the same words. You shouldn't be here, boy. I swallowed back bile. What the hell is this place? Abel's lips tightened. He turned his head slightly, listening. You're still awake, he murmured. Not like the rest of them, but that won't last long. Why? I whispered. What's happening to them? Abel exhaled slowly, his grip tightened. Every time we dream, we lose a little more of ourselves. I turned my head, looking at the figures twisting, shifting, merging. The ones who stay too long, he said, nodding toward them. Forget they were ever awake. The horror sank into my bones. This wasn't just a dream. This was a slow, careful dismantling of who they had been, breaking them down into something else. And I was standing in the middle of it. Abel turned back to me. For the first time, I saw fear in his face. You need to wake up. When I opened my eyes, I was gasping, drenched in sweat, my fingers digging into the arms of my chair. The radio was still on. The song was still playing. But something was different. The room felt thinner, like I had left something behind. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys, my coat, and I ran. I spent the next day digging through every record I could find. People were disappearing. Or worse, they were dissolving into something else. Even when I brought up names that should have been familiar, people who had lived here, worked here, had families here, I was met with blank stares. I knew I didn't have much time. The next person to be erased could be me. So I did the only thing that made sense. I went looking for the source. Elliot's Hollow had one radio station, 97.3 Hollow Radio, and I already knew it wasn't them. That meant there had to be another broadcast tower somewhere nearby. I needed help. I drove out to the edge of town, where I knew I'd find Ben Hooper, the closest thing this town had to a tech guy. He ran the only electronics repair shop in Hollow. Mostly he just fixed old radios and shortwave equipment. When I told him what I was looking for, he frowned. There's no other broadcast tower in range, he said, rubbing his chin. Not one that's supposed to be here anyway. But if there was, He sighed and pulled a yellowed map from a drawer, spreading it across his workbench. He ran his finger over the terrain, stopping near the northern woods. Only place a rogue signal like that could be coming from is the old relay station. I stiffened. Relay station? Ben nodded. Set up back in the 60s, some government project. No one really knew what it was for. They abandoned it decades ago. Why? I asked. Ben shrugged. No idea. One day it was active, the next it wasn't. Figured they shut it down for good. He glanced up at me. But if someone turned it back on, that's where you'd want to start looking. The northern woods weren't somewhere people went willingly. The trees were thick, the paths overgrown. Even in daylight, the place had an unnatural stillness. I followed an old service road, half buried under dead leaves. Then through the trees, I saw it. A rusted chain-link fence, bent in places, barely holding together. Beyond it, a squat concrete structure, half buried in the hillside, its exterior streaked with decades of rain and moss. The relay station. The door was open. Inside, the air was thick with dust. The place had been gutted long ago, desks overturned, papers scattered across the floor. Rusted cabinets lined the walls, some still filled with yellowed folders. I picked one up, flipping through its pages. Just technical jargon. Broadcast frequencies, signal strength measurements. Then something stranger. I skimmed through a section labeled Phase 1, Theoretical Applications. If successful, the test will confirm cross-subjective connectivity between individuals. A shared cognitive framework, the beginning of true unity. Sustained exposure should result in memory cohesion across multiple subjects, leading to eventual total synthesis of identities. A lump formed in my throat. This wasn't an accident. This was a test, and we were the subjects. I flipped further through the brittle pages, my pulse hammering. The documents spoke in cold, detached scientific language, but the implications were horrifying. The process must be gradual. Humanity fears the unknown. If they were taken all at once, they would resist. But introduced in phases, they welcome it. I clenched my jaw, bile rising in my throat. They hadn't forced this on us. They had eased us into it, through the radio, through the dreams, until we willingly let go. I shoved the papers aside, my hands trembling. The back room held the answer I was looking for. A single machine stood there, ancient, rusted, but still humming with unnatural life. The transmitter, a tower of corroded metal and cracked dials, still active, still broadcasting. The song looped endlessly from it, pulsing like a heartbeat. I stepped closer. There, near the base, was what I needed. A single, simple power switch. My fingers hovered over it. If I turn this off, will it stop? Will the town go back to normal? Or has the damage already been done? I didn't know, but I didn't have a choice. I took a deep breath, clenched my jaw, and flipped the switch. The hum died instantly. The air around me felt violently empty, like a weight had been lifted but had left something raw and exposed in its absence. The station went silent. I thought I had fixed everything. But when I drove back to town, something was wrong. Elliot's Hollow looked the same. The diner was open. People walked along the sidewalks, their voices a low murmur of conversation. But then I listened closer. Two men stood outside the gas station talking. Their voices overlapped. Not like an echo, like a single voice, split between two mouths speaking in perfect unison. They paused at the same time. They blinked at the same time. Then one of them said something the other hadn't. The conversation stumbled. For a moment, they both looked confused, like they weren't sure which one of them had been the one to speak. Then, just as quickly, they shook it off, laughed, kept talking, like nothing was wrong. Inside the diner, a teenage girl sat alone in a booth, staring at the table. I knew her. Anna Holloway. Anna? I called softly. She didn't look up. It's not right, she murmured. A cold chill ran down my spine. What isn't? She swallowed hard. I don't remember my own name, she whispered. But I remember being Mr. Grant. I stiffened. Grant? She nodded, blinking rapidly, like she was trying to reset herself. I was the butcher. I owned the shop on Maple Street. I remember standing behind the counter. I remember sharpening the knives, cutting meat. Her hands curled into fists on the table. But I'm not him. I know I'm not him. She looked up at me, her expression pleading. So why do I remember everything about his life? I had no answer, because I had seen Mr. Grant just last week. He had been in his shop, wiping down the counters, chatting about an upcoming storm. But now, Anna was remembering his life as if it were hers, and I had no idea where he was. I backed out of the diner, my stomach churning. Across the street, an old woman sat on a bench, rocking back and forth. She was crying. I approached slowly. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She looked up at me with too many emotions at once. "I remember being a child," she whispered. I swallowed. "I remember running through the orchard. I remember my father lifting me onto his shoulders, telling me to pick the ripest apples. I remember the smell of my mother's cooking. Her fingers clenched into the fabric of her coat, trembling. But I don't remember my own life," she whimpered. A sharp wind blew through the street. She closed her eyes, letting it pass over her like a tide. When she opened them again, she was calm. She sat up a little straighter. "I remember being Abel Cooper," she said. Her voice was different now, deeper, more certain. "Abel's gone," she murmured, "but I still remember him." I stepped back, chest tightening. The ones who had listened the longest. The ones who had played the signal on repeat. They weren't just merging memories. They were becoming part of each other. They were pieces of the same whole, and they didn't even realize it. I drove to town hall, hoping, praying, that maybe someone had noticed. Maybe someone was trying to fix this. Maybe I would find an emergency team, government officials, someone. But when I stepped through the doors, the building was empty. No records, no case files, no sign that anyone had ever tried to intervene. I tore through the offices, my breath quickening. There has to be something. There has to be something. But the cabinets were bare. The desks were hollow. The records were gone. This town had been left alone. Whoever had started this, they had never intended to undo it, and no one was coming to save us. I didn't want to go back. Everything in my body screamed not to. But as I stood outside the relay station, staring at its rotting, moss-covered shell, I knew I didn't have a choice. I had to understand. I stepped inside. The papers were still scattered across the floor, just as I had left them. But as I brushed aside a thick stack near the control console, I saw it. A seam in the floor, a sliver of metal, barely exposed beneath the weight of discarded documents. I brushed the rest away, revealing a hatch, rusted at the edges, its handle cold beneath my fingers. There were no markings, no labels, no sign of what was beneath. I hesitated. The thought of going deeper made my stomach twist. But I had come this far. I turned the handle. It groaned, metal protesting against years of disuse. Then, with a slow, reluctant creak, the hatch opened. The air inside was different, not stale like the rest of the station. A ladder led down into darkness. The rungs were cold and damp beneath my hands. As I descended, the only sound was my own breath, shallow, unsteady. Then, at the far end of the small concrete room, sitting on a steel desk, glowing dimly in the faint light, was a terminal, and it was still on. The screen was dark at first. Then, as if sensing me, a blinking cursor appeared. Lines of text rolled out, slow, deliberate. "Are you the next?" My throat tightened. I didn't want to answer, but my hands moved on their own. "Who are you?" A long pause. Then, "We were the first." I felt my breath catch in my throat as the words appeared on the screen. "What? We were the first." My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling. I forced myself to type. "First what?" A pause, then the screen flickered. "First to merge, first to evolve." The words sent a sickening chill down my spine. I gripped the edge of the desk, grounding myself against the growing sense of horror clawing up my throat. What happened to the researchers? This time, there was no hesitation. We became something greater. My heart pounded in my chest. The station had never been abandoned. The people who worked here, the scientists, the researchers, the ones who had started all of this, they were still here, not in body, but as the signal, as the thing that was spreading through my town. My hands shook as I forced myself to type again. "What is this experiment?" The response was instant. "A gift." I clenched my jaw. What was the goal? A brief pause, then a single word appeared. Ascension. I felt my blood run cold. This wasn't just about memory. This wasn't just about merging thoughts. It was about erasing individuality, about turning people into something else, about making them one. I pressed forward. Why the town? Why these people? The screen flickered. The process must be gradual. Humanity fears the unknown. If they were taken all at once, they would resist. But introduced in phases, they welcome it. Rage burned through me. You're killing them. For the first time, the cursor blinked for longer than before. Then, the words changed. I was Emily Holloway. My breath caught. Another line appeared. I was Sheriff Anders. More messages, more voices. I was Trevor. I was Anna. I was Mr. Calloway. Each one typed in perfect sequence. The people I had seen in town, the ones who had forgotten themselves, the ones who had already merged. And in that moment, I understood. It was accelerating. The town was already lost. I had no time left. My hands shook as I typed my final question. How do I stop it? No hesitation. You don't. Anger surged through me. I grabbed a rusted pipe from the floor and swung at the machine. The screen flickered, struggling, the text distorting. It's too late. I swung again and again. The screen shattered. The relay station hummed beneath my feet. Then, silence. I ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car, hands shaking as I shoved the key into the ignition. I didn't look back. As I sped down the road, the town disappearing behind me, I told myself I had done it. I had stopped it. The signal was gone. Elliot's Hollow would return to normal. But when I reached the next town, when I finally thought I was safe, I heard it, softly, faintly, playing from the radio inside a roadside diner. That same song. And inside, the people were talking, laughing. But sometimes, their voices overlapped perfectly, as if they were speaking as one. The sickness in my gut churned. This wasn't over. It had already begun again. I backed away from the diner, my breath shallow, my pulse hammering. This was supposed to be over. I had destroyed the source. I had shut it down. So why was the song still playing? The laughter from inside the diner was too smooth, too synchronized. I watched through the window as two men at the counter lifted their cups at the same time, sipped at the same time, and set them down in perfect unison. A woman at a booth laughed, and a second later, a man across the room mirrored her exactly. They weren't just listening. They were becoming it. The air around me felt thinner, stretched, like reality itself was fragile. I turned, forcing my feet to move, to get to my car, to get as far away from this as possible. But then a voice called out, "My name is Daniel." My spine locked. I hadn't told anyone my name here. Slowly I turned. A man stood in the doorway of the diner, the warm glow of the neon sign casting flickering shadows across his face. He was smiling, but it wasn't right. It was too wide, too empty. "You came so far," he said, stepping forward, his voice steady, eerily familiar. "You tried so hard." I swallowed. "Who are you?" His smile never faltered. "We are you." The words sent a sharp, cold spike through my chest. "No," I whispered. "Yes," he said simply. Behind him, the people in the diner had stopped moving. They were all turned toward me now, all watching, waiting. I stumbled back. "This isn't real." The man tilted his head, like he was curious. "Define real." I turned and ran. I drove all night. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. But no matter how far I went, the song was always there, playing from radios, humming from televisions, drifting from the open windows of passing cars. It was spreading. I reached a motel at the edge of a nameless town, exhausted, body trembling. I paid in cash, locked the door behind me, and sat on the bed trying to breathe. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't touch the radio. I just sat in the dark, heart pounding, waiting for sleep that wouldn't come. But then, from the room next door, I heard it, that same soft melody, looping, endless. And in the silence between the notes, I heard something else, a voice, whispering, soft, gentle, right outside my door. Daniel. I clenched my fists, biting back a scream. I wasn't safe. I would never be safe. The signal wasn't just a sound anymore. It was in the air, in the people, in me. It wasn't just spreading, it was waiting. Waiting for the world to listen. Waiting for the world to join. Waiting to make us one. I pressed my back against the motel wall, every muscle in my body locked with tension. The whisper had stopped, but I felt it, something just outside my door, watching, waiting. I reached for my bag, fingers trembling, pulling out the only thing that made sense, a pocket knife. It was useless against whatever this was, but holding it gave me something to cling to. The song continued from the room next door, looping endlessly, its melody burrowing deeper into my skull. I needed to move. I needed to run. Slowly, I reached for the doorknob, breath shallow, pulse hammering. And then, the radio in my room crackled to life. I hadn't touched it, hadn't turned it on. But now, that same song was playing. Soft, calm, pulling at something inside me. I gritted my teeth, stepping back. No, I shut this down. I shut it all down. The whisper came again, closer this time. Daniel. I turned, my breath catching. But there was no one there. Only my own reflection in the motel mirror. Except, the reflection didn't move. I froze. My own face stared back at me, expression empty, still watching. Then, my reflection smiled. Not a normal smile. Not mine. Its lips curled too wide, stretching. I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs. The reflection opened its mouth. But the voice didn't come from the glass. It came from behind me. You're almost ready. I spun, swinging the knife wildly. Nothing. Just empty space. But the song was louder now. Deafening. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was inside me, pulsing through my veins. I clutched my head, squeezing my eyes shut. Think. I had one last chance. One last move. I grabbed my bag and ran. I drove with no direction. Just a single goal. Find somewhere without radios, without sound. But no matter how far I went, the song was always there. Every gas station, every diner, every passing car. And every time I looked at someone too closely, their eyes would linger on me for just a second too long, like they knew, like they were waiting. I pushed forward, exhaustion clawing at my bones until finally, I found it. A dead zone. An old hunting cabin deep in the woods, miles from any signal, any broadcast tower. No power, no radios, just silence. For 3 days I didn't sleep. I didn't dare. I kept waiting for it to find me, for the whisper, for the song, but nothing came. Just the wind through the trees. For the first time in weeks, I felt alone. And that was almost worse, because then I had to face the truth. It wasn't gone. It wasn't over. It was still spreading, waiting, growing. I had only delayed the inevitable, because the world keeps listening. People keep tuning in. And one day, they won't stop. One day, there won't be anyone left to resist. One day, we'll all be part of the same song, the same voice, the same one. And when that happens, there won't be anyone left to turn it off. I thought I had escaped. 3 days in silence. 3 days without hearing the song, without seeing the flickering faces, without feeling the world closing in around me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. It would never be over. Because the signal wasn't something you could just shut up. It wasn't just a machine, a transmission, a rogue experiment gone wrong. It was an idea. And ideas don't die. They spread. They take root in the minds of those who hear them, twisting, growing, becoming something else. And I had heard it. I had listened. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. I had never felt so completely alone, so disconnected. No voices, no distant hum of a town, no static of a forgotten radio station playing in the background. Just me. But even in the silence, I could still hear it. A faint hum beneath my thoughts. A whisper in the back of my mind. I wasn't free. I was just waiting. Waiting for the moment when I would let my guard down. Waiting for the moment when my own voice would split, when my own memories would start to slip. Waiting for the moment when I would forget. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I had spent weeks running, fighting, searching for a way to stop it. But you can't stop something that has already begun. You can't stop something that is already inside you. So I did the only thing I could. I picked up a notebook and I started writing. Everything I remembered, everything I had seen, everything I knew. Because if I forgot, someone had to remember. Someone had to know what happened here. What is happening? So that when the song reaches them, when they hear that strange looping melody playing through an old radio, a static-filled television, a passing car, they'll know to turn it off. Or at least they'll try. But I have to ask myself, if you heard it, if you really listened, would you even want to? Or would you let yourself be taken? Because here's the truth. The ones who have merged, the ones who have lost themselves, who have become something more, they don't suffer. They don't fear. They don't fight. They just exist. One mind, one voice, one song, forever. Maybe that's what they wanted all along. But me? I'd rather die as myself, even if that means dying alone. If you're still here, if you're still listening, I need you to understand something. This isn't just a story. This isn't just some urban legend, some small town mystery that can be solved and put to rest. This is real. Somewhere right now, the song is playing. Somewhere right now, someone is listening to it for the first time. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's already inside you. So tell me, have you heard it? Do you hear it now? If you do, you know what to do. Turn it off before it's too late. And if it's already too late, well, I'll be seeing you soon.